next session, How to Mix a Film with Sreejesh Nair. Sreejesh Nair is an award-winning re-recording mixer with over 20 years of experience and more than 200 films to his credit, and a national award winner for Gangs of Wasseypur. He has been at the forefront of innovation, including contributing to India's first Dolby Atmos mixed theatre. He currently serves as an audio application specialist at Avid. In this session, he will share practical insights, industry tips, and versatile mixing principles applicable across theatre and streaming formats alike.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming for this talk. Uh, so when Smitha asked me, like I actually asked Smitha, can I do a talk? And then she asked me, what do you want to talk about? And I was like, how to mix a film. And then when I was looking at all the topics, my topic was the shortest title. And what's interesting, so I gave the topic, and after I gave the topic, I was like, see, I've been mixing films for more than 20 years now, and sometimes you would see like my experience and the age of some of the people over here. The experience of some of the people over here and my age are the same. So when I put up this topic of how to mix a film, like even after 20 years, the answer is I don't know. There is no answer to that. And if someone can come up with an answer to that, that is not the final answer because it keeps changing. I mean, the truth is I have ideas, I have processes that I trust. There are things that I know, there are habits which I do. And today, rather than doing a very technical talk, I want to do a different talk, something that I've not done in the past couple of palms at all. So I want to take you through the journey of what happens when you sit in that room. I mean, you can learn about EQ, compression, saturation, reverbs. You can talk about divergence. You can talk about decorrelation and all sorts of technical things that you want to talk about. But those are things that you can always read up on the internet. And when I started working as well, I still haven't found a lot of information on how you actually mix something. I mean, there are people who can tell you how to EQ things. You can learn compression all over the place. But what happens in a film when the director is next to you, someone like Vijay is sitting next to you, your sound designer and the music director and the producer, and everyone's sitting there saying, yeah, we want the thunder, but we also want the strings to sound over there. And what do you do? So that's kind of the journey that we want to take through this. Now, as with everything, there are certain rules in this. And when I say rules, these are not rules that are set in stone. These are more like guidelines, just like the traffic signals we have after 10 o'clock in the night. It's more like a suggestion. So these are the things that I actually follow. And it's always a rule of three. And I found that everything that I do, just like Gethin and Donald, they have three things, and it's always a multiple of three that you'll see everywhere. That's also because probably three is the most stable number in a three-dimensional space. You can't have a table with two legs. I mean, you can, but then you wouldn't want to use it. So we will be looking at three things: technique, art, and performance. And by this, I absolutely mean this, because when you're mixing a film, it is a performance. It's a performance in front of the director. It's a performance in front of the sound designer. It's a performance in every space. But at the end of the day, it's also one of the only art forms that I know where you should not be noticed. It's like one of the greatest art forms where you should be invisible. And the only other thing is magic, but that's a different thing. So there's a difference between when you meet a good sound designer or a mixer and you meet a regular person. You meet a regular person, you ask, how do you do? And if it's a good mix, you ask, how do you do it? So that's a slight difference that is there. So we will be talking about technique. I will be talking about art. And I will also talk about how you can transform art into technique on your DAW, which is very important. It's easy to talk about art in a superficial way. Because it's an opinion. Everyone has an opinion. It's like, take my opinion, I don't use it anyways. But I'll talk about how you can use this, and I'll also talk about things that are very less spoken about in the mix world. Cool. So we'll start with the technique. Now, when I say technique, these are not tips and tricks. The technique is actually a different form of the technology that we use. See, you have to understand how to EQ. You have to learn to EQ, to compress, and to sort your things out. You have to understand what your converter does. You have to understand what the format does, because the format will keep evolving. The DAWs will have new features. You have to be on top of what the new features are. But apart from all of that, it's also you have to understand how do you turn it around to make it work for you, just like what Vijay showed, and just like what everyone else will talk about. So here's the first thing that you need to understand. A film is not a very complex thing. A film is made up of, again, three things: dialogue, effects, and music. And that is it. These are the only three things that a film is made of. Now, if you look at it in this way, it's actually a very simple thing to mix, right? Oh, you've got dialogue, you've got effects, you've got music. That translates to three faders. You sum all of it, you get the final mix. And when you don't want the dialogue, you get the M&E, which is the music and effects, which is very important if you want to translate your movie into another language. And that's it. So like three faders. Why do we need 32 or 64 faders on a console? A good question. And that requires us to drive down into what each of these boxes are. Because each of this box is actually a universe in itself. And that's actually pretty amazing when you think of it. And the reason I want to dive into each one of this box is, how many tracks do you think is a good number of tracks? Like something that's difficult. If I were to ask you, maybe like say 300, 400 tracks, 500 tracks, yeah? 500 tracks is a bit difficult. If you were to scroll up and down, that's easily like 30 seconds a minute. 30 seconds a minute is a long time. And if you work for 8 hours a day, you know that's a lot of coffee time. But the way to get around this is to always organize your session. And what I'm going to talk about is the idea behind, the thought process behind organizing. You can take this as a blueprint and then forward that with any which way that you want to work. Because at the end of the day, the audience doesn't care how your session looks like. The audience only cares how it sounds. But for you to get it to that point, if it takes you a whole lot of time, that is very inefficient. And if you want something done with high efficiency, give it to a lazy person. I am a very lazy person. I actually am. So let's look at dialogues. Now, this is what a dialogue is made of. So if you were to think of this in terms of folder tracks, let's say, for example, in Pro Tools, if your master folder track, let's call that as a routing folder. You know what a routing folder is, where you have an input and an output, and the tracks are groups inside that folder. So within that dialogue folder, you will have production tracks, which are tracks that are recorded on location. You will have an ADR, which are tracks that are recorded maybe because it's a VO, you wanted to change the line, or the actor or the actors does not speak the native language. You know, there's some interference that happens during shoot and all of that. And then you have crowd. And there's a reason you want to manage those separately, which I'll tell you. If you break down production, you will have boom and lavs or lapel mics. So you might have two booms, you might have a single boom, you'll have multiple lapels that are on the actors. So you can see how you can break each one of this into separate tracks and how each one of those tracks are managed as well. Now, boom and lapels are recorded on location, which means they carry the reverb of the space that is there. So boom, because it's a bit far, will have a perspective, and lapel, because it's a bit close, you'll have a different one. So there's also this question of when do you use what? So predominantly, I end up using the boom, and when I want a bit more definition and body, there's always the lapel that has to be time aligned to the boom. Again, this is where you need to learn the technology part of it. So you have to time align, because the time of arrival from my sound to my lapel is faster than my sound to the boom, which is a bit far. And then if you don't timeline, you'll have phase issues, and that's when you learn about phase, and then you learn about phase interaction. And so you see how technology is embedded in all of this. But we're not going to talk about that. You can always read about all of that. So you have the boom and the lapel. Those already have reverbs. Now, when you do an ADR or a dialogue replacement, you can either do it to replace a certain word because of noise. You want to replace a character. You want to have a VO, a voiceover. And EFX would be like, let's say you have a robot or a monster and someone's doing those vocals. Those are also to be treated separately. The trick here is, if you think about it logically, boom and lapel mics are usually mono. If you take your ADR and add a stereo reverb and try to match it to this, it's not going to match. So you take your ADR and match it to the boom and the lapel, with the pitch and the EQ and the reverb being in mono. Once you do that, The secondary reverb and delay and all of those processes that you have, that defines the room. Because cinema happens in two spaces. The story happens from the screen that way, but the entire world we build is from the screen this way. So everything that you want for impact and effects and everything happens this way. We rarely build anything that way. But then the dialogue will only come from the center channel. I mean, mostly. Because you don't want to take the entire noise and pan that. So if say someone's walking across a room and I have placed individual characters all around here, and then if someone's walking, I would want to pan the person. But if his boom has a lot of noise and pick up from, let's say, whatever the ambience there is or from the associated track is, I won't be able to pan him because then that will also take noise along with that. That's when I would use a label to pan because that is more clean, that has him. This also tells you how you can choose what tracks to use. So your decision is completely made on what you see on screen. And from here, you will notice everything I say depends on what you see on screen and the story. You cannot mix without knowing the story. It is impossible for you to mix. Again, so once we have the boom and the lapels and we have the ADR, I have a single section that handles the room reverbs or the processing reverbs for this. Because for me and for the reverb, this entire thing is supposed to be one unit. And the reason I have this separate is because when we do a dialogue premixes, so a premix is something that you do before the final mix. You kind of have to get everything ready before the final mix. So when you do the premixes, you often do not have the music or the ambience or things like that. So what happens is you might set your reverb, it'll sound perfect, it's the exact delay slap back that you have on your bathroom. You're looking at the diffusion values and all of that, it's all great. And then they put an ambience and you hear nothing. So I always have a separate track that controls my total reverb levels on my dialogues. And that is important. And that is something I learned over time. You fall a lot, you get up, you realize, okay, there's a hole there. You don't want to go into that. You try to cross that. So I have a separate fader for this so that in the final mix, because you should also remember it doesn't end with the ambience. There's also the score. And we don't know what kind of a score is going to come. You might have a reference, and then the reference will be nothing like the score that is coming. Because we all know everyone's reference is The Dark Knight and Inception. And you can't do that. So I have a separate reverb and a delay fader to control that part. Now, when I do the crowd is separate because the crowd can have two things. The crowd can either have language in it, or it can be just like a murmur that you hear over here. The crowd can be recorded on location. If you're doing like a huge war film, you already have 200, 300 people on set. Maybe you can do all of those cries, try fitting them in a big room. You will get the room rather than the people. And no one wants to sound like the room in a battlefield. Yeah, what are you doing in a room in a battlefield? That makes no sense. And those are always separate. And the reason for that is, you remember the M&E that I said in the beginning. So if there are dialogue lines in that, I can split them off. Plus also remember, crowd is always to be balanced slightly differently because let's say there's a war happening or it's a busy street, and then you have a pan shot that comes in straight to the actor, and then the actor is walking in a busy street. You can't have the crowd and the dialogues on the same fader because once you get to the actor, you want the crowd to go down. The question is, do you just want the crowd levels to go down? Do you want to bring the mids of the crowd down so that you can have the transients of the dialogue? Those are techniques that you can read up on. But these are the ideas. This is a blueprint behind that. And that's why I have the crowd and the reverbs. And so again, the crowd reverb is usually different from the reverb that you would use for dialogues. Because when you're talking about dialogues, remember, the most important thing you can't hear the sound. Yeah. That's because the most important thing is the dialogue. And you pick that up in less than a couple of seconds. So this is what happens. It doesn't matter if my mic distorts, if you hear music out there, it doesn't matter. The moment sound stops, it's very weird. So dialogue is king, unless you're working on a silent film. And you know right now how weird it is to not have dialogue, especially when you see me talking. But if I was turning that way, it doesn't matter. This is a distinction between allocentric and egocentric mixing. Allocentric mixing is when you're mixing to an anchor point. You have something there, you're looking at something, that something has to make sense with your sound. Egocentric mixing is when the mixing happens around you, like music or games or things like that. In cinema, you can actually do both. You can make the audience part of the act. You can take them out of the act. You can do all sorts of things in cinema, and that's why mixing cinema is incredible. It's not just sitting in a dark room for 8 hours. It's a bit more. Okay, cool. So now that we have the dialogues, the next one is effects, which Vijay did a very detailed session on. But for me, when I get the SFX, this is generally how I get the session. So the SFX, which are the hard effects, like the car doors, the punches, the car passes, the whooshes, and the design, the guns, and everything. Yeah, everything that I said was a bit violent. So the birds and things like that. So it comes as A, B, and C. And the reason it's A, B, and C is because let's say you take an explosion scene. Now, if someone fires something and it lands and there's a debris, there's an explosion and a debris and all of that. So someone's firing a grenade launcher. So there's a boom that goes, it comes and lands and it bursts, and you have all the debris. Now, if all of this were to be separated, so the grenade launcher will have the thump of the grenade, the mechanics of this going, the launch of the grenade, there'll be a whoosh for the travel. It'll come, there's an impact that it hits, there's a debris, the debris might fall off somewhere else, you might have fire, and then you might have the character looking in a daze. All of those things might happen. Now, don't ask me if this was evening, if it's raining and all of that. We'll come to that later. But for this one, if you think about this, the mechanics that's got high frequencies in it, the thump that has got a wideband in it, the whoosh that's a wideband sound, it falls, the impact is a wideband sound with a transient. The debris does not have a lot of low ends, but it has high frequencies in it. If I have all of this together, I'm going to find it very difficult to mix, because if I want to cut off the low ends of the whoosh for some reason, how do I do that? I'm not going to scroll through 500 tracks of, action sequences to find out where this is. That's why grouping is very important. And the reason it's named as A, B, C, or D, or, even if it's guns and things like that, let's say you have a film that's 8 reels wrong, but 8 reels long, not wrong. Can't be wrong, hopefully. 8 reels long, and you have one sequence that lasts 5 minutes with an action sequence. If that's the only thing with guns in your entire session, when you look at your session, if you have 8 reels in a session, you will have 7 reels which are empty, and then 1 reel with action. So you also have to figure out a way to manage these things. And here's the thing. Ideally, when you track lay in groups of 8. That's a very important number. 8 is pretty amazing. And the reason, of course, it's 2 cube, but it's also because every console comes in banks of 8. So you have 8 faders, 8 faders, 8 faders. So if you're doing in banks of 8, let's say you have a 16 fader console, you'll bank to the next 16. If you have 10 faders, you bank, and if it's an 8 fader console, you'll bank, you'll lose the first one, you'll have 2 of them, and the rest of them will be something else. So do it in multiples of 8. So you can have 8 mono, 8 stereo, 4 mono, 4 stereo, kind of things, right? So that's what SFX is. Now, when it comes to ambience, the grouping is slightly different. So in ambience, it's usually checkerboarding. So what checkerboarding means is it's like a chessboard. So you have these alternate groups. So scene 1 will have, let's say, the first set of tracks, which will be A. Scene 2 will be in B. And if you go back to scene 3, it can come back to A. And the reason you split this is so that your pans, your reverbs, your EQs are all separate. Now, again, how do you premix faster than runtime? That's what everyone wants to know, right? You can do that. So my workflow primarily depends on using something that's called a preview mode in Pro Tools. I set it up. And remember, ambience is usually static. You leave a pan there, you let it be. So I solo the tracks, I set up it a preview, I select the tracks, I select the length, I set up my levels, I set up my reverbs, I set up my EQ, my pans, and I punch it, I go on to the next one. And this going on to the next one is actually instant. So I do not sit and listen to the entire 2 minutes of ambient, which is not right. So what I do is, once I have the ambience done, what I do is there's a technique that I do where I flip the pans to my faders. So when it's playing, I touch random faders, which means I'm moving the front back pan. And because it's random, your ambience is alive. It's alive because you cannot predict what happens next. It's unpredictable. And that's the beauty of humans versus AI. AI, after a point, it gives you the most predictable, accurate answer. And the reason why I think humans will exist, and in terms of what you do and your curative and your creative decisions will exist, is because of that unpredictability. That is actually the question that I asked. The randomness and the mistakes that we do is the reason we landed on the moon. It was not because of us being very predictable in things. So it's okay to make mistakes as long as someone else is paying for it. Right. And then there's Foley. Now, Foley is always split up into footsteps and the incidentals. Incidentals would be like hand grabs and taps and cloth shuffles and all of that. And the reason is footsteps invariably have a lot of transients in it. So you cannot take a content with a lot of transients and blend it in with the, I mean, you have to blend it in, but they won't work in the same aux or the same processing channel. So for me, for example, for footsteps, I use a lot of saturation just to make it a little fatter. So that's the reason I use saturation, is so that the transients get low, then you have the effect of the tan edge or the kind of saturation that you use. You get the low mids in, and then you have to go in and decide if you want to oversample it or working in 96K. That's again the technology part that you have to read about. So you will see a lot of technique and technology, and fundamentals is important when you're learning this. But that's the fun part. You can learn all of that independently. And how do you put all of them together is this. So I have the footsteps and the incidentals. And the reason I have separate reverbs for all of this is because if someone's coming in from afar, you want to have the footsteps echo in that room. But that's a completely different reverb you would use if someone's clocking a gun or, right at that point. These reverbs cannot be the same. I mean, they have to sound similar. So that's the cheat. That's the hack that happens in film mixing. Film mixing, like digital audio, is a hack. The end goal is to make you think it sounds okay. If it's okay, if it's not broken, don't fix it. That's the thing. You have to follow that principle. Now, when this happens, so I can't use the same reverbs. And again, over time, I figured that, okay, there are 3 separate reverbs, 3 separate relays. So I can have 3 separate faders for this. And that's how all of this goes into my effects folder. And that goes to my final mix folder. And then we have music. Now, usually when we say music, if this was a crowd that was somewhere in Europe or, I would have ended with the first one. But for us, that last one is more important than the first one, because the first one kind of stays in the background and the last one comes into the foreground. Whether they're lip syncing or not, you will have a tree. And that is very important. But that's a bit different now. So now the songs have changed over the past couple of years. You have songs that drive the story forward rather than a song being there for the reason of the song, which is a great way of filmmaking. So the score is the score. You have percussion, strings, and all of those separate elements that come to you. They can either be stereo, 5.1, 7.1, or however it was recorded. And those will have their own reverb and delay processing that goes to the score. The source is very important. So that can be a song that's playing out of a radio or a TV or a PA system. And that's important because that's a song that when you start the mix, will say, okay, this is a song we want to use. Yeah, this is it. This is great. You do all the processing in that. You give the delays and everything. And by the end of your mix, you'll say, yeah, but we didn't get the rights of the song. We'll have to do something else. If you put that into here and then try to do all of that work again, that's a waste of time. Give it to a lazy person. And this is a lazy person. So you keep that separate, knowing that those are things that are going to change. So once you have that, you can make sure that, okay, whether they have the license or not, if they get the license, fair enough. If not, this is just a track that you need to replace. And then you have the song. Again, the music and the vocals are separate because the vocals will not go into the M&E because they want to definitely dub the song separately. And this is what makes the entire song part. So you can see there are 3 different parts of this. And all of that comes into the music, which gets into the final mix. So now if you take those 3 boxes that we saw and you break it up, if you combine it, this is how it will look like. So 3 simple boxes are actually made up of subgroups, which are made up of subgroups, which are made up of tracks, which have their own processing, which have your own ideas in this. Now, we haven't come to ideas yet. This is just the managing part that I was talking about. So what happens? So now you have this one. And here's a very important part. It does not matter what format you do, whether you're doing a film, a documentary, an episodic, an Atmos film, it does not matter what you do. The fundamental principle is this. See, sound, the fundamentals of sound haven't changed from the early 40s. Of course, ambisonics came in the 70s, but after Michael Garzon, there was not a lot of people who actually came up and experimented with all of those width and things like that. But the fundamentals will stay for a very, very long time, just like this. The fundamentals will stay. Now, when you go into Atmos, which is an immersive format, and I speak about Atmos specifically because that is the most prevalent format we have. In fact, we also have it embedded within Pro Tools. In fact, we have a lot of other formats like the MPEG Edge, the Sony 360 RA, also embedded within Pro Tools. So you have a lot of immersive formats. But when it comes to film, Dolby Atmos is something that stands out. It is the exact same idea. You have a dialogue, effects, music with the bed and objects. You can read up what a bed is and object is. So as a quick note, an object is something that requires a specific placement. A bed is something that just kind of can be there. And then those go to the render. And the reason you split this up is so that you can get your final mix, final 7.1, 5.1, and your individual stems. So the dialogue, music, and the effects separately, which is important if you're cutting trailers or you want to do a separate mix for OTT and things like that. Cool. And the way this works in a mix studio is you have one setting, one machine that does the playback, and another one that does the recording. From here, this is the simplest thing. Now, from here, you can expand this. You can have one machine that does just the dialogue and the music and another machine that handles effects. You can have one machine that handles the dialogue and the effects, another one that handles just the music, depending on how it is. You can have multiple machines. There are studios that have 7 machines up as well. And that's why the Avid S6 can go all the way up to 8 machines, 8 systems on the surface. In fact, you can have 1 fader per system as well if you want. So when you take it to the bare minimum, the smallest thing that is there, and then you can scale up from that, you will see exactly where you can break this down to scale. So now if I tell you, you want to split effects into a different machine because there are so many tracks, you know how the tracks are organized. Okay, if it's FX, it's got SFX, ambience, and Foley. SFX has this, ambience has this, Foley has this. These are the number of reverbs you will need. This is how it is going to go back, and this is where it will come out from. So once you get the fundamental idea, it's much easier to do this. Now, this is the technique, the technology part, and all of that. So we come to the art. The art is something that is very subjective. So there is no right way to explain this. There is no mistake that you can do in art. There are mistakes that you can do which are technically wrong, but there is no mistake when you do in art because every art is kind of like a mistake. That's why it makes it random. So there are 3 things in this. And before I get to that, have any one of you seen this? It's called the circumplex model of FX. It's an incredible chart. It was made in the 1980s by James Russell. So basically what it tells you is it maps all of your emotions on a chart. The top one, as you go up, it's active. As you go down, it's passive and calm. And this way is positive and this way is negative. Very simple, right? So if you take a couple of things, like let's say you're frustrated. Your frustration is a negative thing and you might be slightly active. That kind of a frustration would be there. If you're sad or depressed, you kind of become calm. You don't act a lot. You tend to, simplify yourself. If you're astonished, the reason astonished is not completely positive is you don't know if it's a good or a bad news, but you're surprised. But then when you're surprised, you become active. And then within this, you can have, all of these sub-models as well. The reason it's called a circumplex is because it was interesting because once these emotions were mapped in, they kind of formed a circle. Now remember, when you're dealing with film, you're telling a story, and a story only drives with emotion. Now, here's the thing. If you're doing a scene that requires excitement, which means you need to be active and it's positive. When it's active, your movements cannot be passive. You cannot have slow, sweeping movements for an excited scene. This is how you can determine what happens to the score versus the dialogue. What happens to the effects? Do you need more HF in the effects? Do you need more of the shakers, more of the sparkly things in the music? This can tell you that. If you're sad or depressed, it's usually a pad. Obviously, you have a long rumble or a deep drone, and your movements are more scaled. They're more sweeping. This is a very important way for you to translate emotions into a DAW or a fader. If you're able to map what is here onto your surface, your storytelling graph will be right. So now what do you have? You have, okay, this is happy, this is sad, this is exciting, this is action, this is that. You have all of this mapped. The next thing to do is, once you know the rule is when you can break it. If you don't know the rule, you don't know what you're breaking. That's just somebody putting a plug in and turning random stuff. You can be lucky sometimes. So these are some of the ideas. I mean, I use a lot more ideas than this. These are some of the ideas that I do. So, and I like to give names for this. For example, the first one I call the bluff. The bluff is actually pretty interesting. In fact, um, I don't know how many of you have seen this. Can you extend your right hand? Extend your right hand. Okay, then extend both of your hands, if you can do that. Extend both of your hands. Open your palm. Keep it up. Turn it up. Now, the next one I want you to follow very closely with me. Close your eyes. Keep your eyes closed. And trust me on this, because now the voice that you're going to hear is me in your head. Now, on your right hand, I'm going to put a couple of books. I'm going to put a big encyclopedia. I'm going to put a medical journal on your book. You can leave your hands relaxed. It's okay. I'm going to put a medical encyclopedia on your right hand. I'm going to put a dictionary on your right hand. I'm going to put maybe the art of sound or something like that on your right hand. I'm going to let it be there. I'm going to let you feel the weight of it on your right hand. And on your left, I'm going to tie a ribbon. I'm going to tie a ribbon connected to a balloon that has got helium in it, and it's a big balloon. So it's much lighter. It'll lift your hand. And it takes it, let's keep it even more light. I add another balloon, it lifts up even more. So in your head, you're balancing both of these at this point. Why don't you open your eyes and look at the positions of your hand? Which hand is down? Your right hand is down. That's how easily you can be tricked. It doesn't take effort. You were just listening to me giving you some instructions. And that the reason you can be tricked is because you are fundamentally designed to be conditioned. If you know the rule that you're fundamentally designed to be conditioned, you can use that in cinema. So for example, I'll give you a practical example of this. So we were doing a film called Gangs of Wasseypur. This was 2012. We were doing a film called Gangs of Wasseypur. The entire film, until the seventh reel of the second part, ran in 5.1. The seventh reel was 7.1. What that meant was, if you're watching the film, until the seventh reel, there is no sound in the back. But your mind has already made up for the fact that this is enough for the film. So when we opened up the action sequences in the back, we did not need level to make your head duck. That was a thing that you never expected to be there. And the idea behind this is it's always a bluff. You can find out places in this where you can trick the audience. You should always try out things to trick the audience. And the second one, imagine first and figure out later. This is very important. For a very long time, my ideas were limited to the plugins that I had in my DAW. With the advent of AI and things like that, that should be a different thing. I like what one of the topics that Gatin and Donald said was that your mind should be there to generate ideas, not hold your thoughts. So you are able to generate ideas. Your ideas should not be limited to the tools that you have in your DAW. Because if you do that, your ideas are then constricted. They are not free-flowing ideas. We all talk about unconditional love and all of that. That means that there's no conditions. You don't need a license to dream. Why do you need a license to do something in Pro Tools? You don't. I mean, you need license to do stuff in Pro Tools, but you don't need license to imagine things in Pro Tools. So imagine first, don't stick to your plugins. That's the way you will find out if there is something that will help with your ideas. And if there is, if not, you can build one. They just showed you how to do that. You can build stuff. You can build it in AI, you can build it up, run it for yourself, share it with the world. Someone else will come up with an idea of that. Do that. Establish pattern and then break it, which is a great thing. It's very similar to the bluff. So if you know that there's dialogue, there's music. There's dialogue, there's music. And after a point, you remove the music because you remember the circumplex, the chart. You can be in a position in there. You keep doing that and you break that. Your mind does not know what to do with that. Which means you no longer have to tell someone, this is how sad you have to be. The person makes up for that in their head. And we did this in Urta Punjab. We did a concept called phantom sounds, where we had tonal elements, that Naren did the score for this. We had tonal elements in that. And what happens is, in the tonal elements, if you remove the fundamental, your mind will make up for the fundamental note. And what is interesting is the way the mind generates the fundamental is dependent on phase. And when it's dependent on phase, it depends on where you sit in the theater. So which means in that sequence, depending on where you sit in the theater, you'll have a such different experience of the film. This is another one that you can do with, create a pattern and then break it. And move elements. This is what I was saying about the ambience. Once you have your ambience there, move it. Movement is life. If it's static, your mind will take over it. Because until now, no one was bothered with that music that came up. That's a static thing that comes up. If you have a show, there's a great show happening, everything is good. For like 30 seconds, you had a feedback and the mic went off. That's the only thing you'll remember in your head. So it's not that we want to remember negative things, but movement is very important for you. And that is the difference between noise and distortion. Distortion is any kind of noise change that happens along with your signal. It traces your signal, which is why we are okay with noise. We are not okay with distortion. Unless you're a guitarist, then it's a different thing. Or you want to do things with sound or with guns, then it's a different thing. So move elements. And everything that I did in my entire career depends only on volume, frequency, and position. You talk about dynamic range, we talk about volume. Dynamic range can also be in terms of frequency. Do you have a lot of lows here? Do you have a lot of highs there? Do you want to scoop off mids? Do you want to go from lows to the highs? And I do that with sequences. So I have sequences that start with a high pass on the ambience, and as the scene goes in, I start opening up the low ends on the ambience. So it kind of draws you in. It fills up the space that you never knew existed. And with position, that's the same thing. You want to be a spectator, or you want to be part of the accident or the action that is happening. And these three things are the only things that I've done in my career. How I do all of this are the techniques. And how these three things talk to each other is the art, which is great. Now, what is the next thing? Is the performance. What do you do with this? How do you sit in a room? It's very important. So for me, when I sit in a mixed room, I sit barefoot. And there's no reason for that. It's just like I like to feel the LFE in that way. I got used to that. I started off in Rajkamal. We had a platform, and I was very happy keeping my foot on that. I like to feel it because you can't hear low frequency. You tend to feel it. And I also have this habit of tapping my leg in a tempo. That tempo is not driven by anything that is specifically there. That is what my body moves to in a scene. Is my movement a bit too fast? Is it too slow? That directs my hands on the faders. When I sit straight. Because if I slop, my muscles on my shoulders will be contracted. That would change the kind of movement I have on my fader. So for example, if I take my finger and do this, that's a linear fade. If I take my finger, do this, and along with that, if I pull my elbow back, that's a logarithmic fade. So you have two different speeds that are happening there. You can do all of this on your fingers, and this is very important, which means you need to know where to place your fingers. And when you place your fingers, you need to know how your hand is. A hand ideally has to be, in parallel with the surface. If it's too low, you will end up having a hurt elbow. If it's too high, you will end up having another hurt elbow. You only have one elbow per hand. But the problem in this is because you're so intrigued in the mix, you're so caught up in the artistry of the work and the kind of output that you're getting, you have no idea of time. So if you don't use that part to sit straight, to make sure you're this thing. So for example, here's the thing. I find I have a very weird way of understanding levels between speakers. So after a point in a mix, if my neck starts to hurt, that's because I'm constantly adjusting to the levels. So like 10 minutes into the mix, if I'm sitting like this, which means I know my balance is off. I might not find it out from the meters. It's very hard sometimes because if you think about the proximity effect, for example, if I have two signals that are going on two channels, if I just delay one of the channels by a couple of samples, the image shifts to the right or to the left, because that is, if I delay the right one, they may shift to the left because that is arriving late. But if you look at your meters, they'll still be showing the same signal, right? But then your head will be this way. That's how I end up making out face. I'm not very good in hearing it. I'm very good in noticing my neck has a cramp a couple of minutes into this. And it's very important to notice yourself in your mix because it's a performance. You have to understand that. And I'll tell you one of the things that I do. So on the console, let's say these are 8 faders, And these are my masters. So I use VCA masters when I'm mixing. So the dialogue VCA controls all the sets of dialogue outputs that are there, whether it's the final output aux or and the objects and all of that. There is a very specific way I lay this out. So I am a right-handed person. My dominant hand is my right hand. So when I sit in front of the console, the faders that get the most movement move to my right. So for me, I tend not to write the dialogues a lot because I try and build the story around the dialogues. If the dialogue is set to a given level, which is good, you also have to respect the performance that is there. You don't want to boost if the actor is going low or the actress is going low. You don't want to boost that unless it's like a major requirement. You want to follow the performance. So the ones that get the most movement move towards the right. And usually the most movement is on the background score, which is the VMX. Slightly less than that is the effects. I wouldn't say less than that because if it's a busy gunshot sequence and you want to have dialogues cut through that, then it's not just levels. You'll also have to look at controlling transients and things like that. And as you come this way, you'll see that it's the least amount of movement. I don't move ambience a lot. It's just around the dialogue. It's either a whole scene up or a whole scene down. This is very important. And this is not something you learn from a book. And it's very hard for you to figure out. These are things you figure out on the job. And once you have this, and this changes if you're a left-hand mixer. And if you're a right-handed mixer, where your master section happens is either on the right. If you're a person who relies a lot on your associates to do a lot of the panning and things like that, your master section or your transport section will be on the left. A lot of all of this thing goes into a thought when you want to sit down to mix. And it's very important to figure all of this out because whatever you do, if you can't drive the emotion, none of this will work. Everything you do, I've never seen a person watching a movie and coming and telling me, dude, that slapback delay you had on the crow that flew up in the third scene was brilliant. No. How was the movie? Did you like the movie? That's pretty much it. That's again, if someone tells you they love the sound, they didn't watch the movie. Yeah, I don't know if there's a better job than where you have to be invisible to be paid. It would be a great job description. So, again, I have the rule of 3. Technique for art. Remember this, and this is something I live by, I strive by. See, the job of mixing is not a technical job that requires art. It is an artistic job that requires technology. Remember this. It is always an artistic job, but you can't pull that off without understanding technology. It is fundamentally an artistic job. You can't do that without the second part, which is listening. Listen to how your grandmother talks to you. Listen to how kids, they cry if they want something. Listen to how two people talk in a coffee shop. Listen to the ambience of it. Actively listen. And the more you listen, you will find out you'll be more curious about things. If you're not curious, you will not be able to pull off most of the things. Your mix will be like a cookie cutter mix. Dialogue, music. Okay, music, dialogue is done, music up. Okay, oh, FX also? Okay, FX. This is what will happen. No, be curious. And when you're curious, you will not get tired of the stuff that you're doing because the moment you get bored, you will go looking for something else that you can do off in that scene. And I get bored with my mixes very fast, which is why I have to come up with new ideas every time. I want to make sure my, 2 of my films don't share the same techniques that I have across. And the last one is take risks. I don't mean like light a fire or something in the studio. No, that's not the risk. Take risks. So what happens if you push the score very close to the dialogue and you're straining to hear the dialogue? Is that going to translate as the audience also feeling the struggle that the character is going through? Which is fine. If they don't like it, you can pull it down. There was once a movie, I remember, this is a great story. So Sreejesh sir was there and, we had a movie and we played it back and there was a producer and the director and they were at loggerheads with each other. So we played a scene, we turned back and Sreejesh sir asked, how was it? The director said, fantastic. The producer said, no, this is not my film. And then they were at loggerheads with each other, which is a very expensive thing. If you have a studio at 7,000 rupees an hour, a half an hour coffee break is 3,500 rupees. That's a very expensive coffee. And this is a very expensive argument. So Sreejesh sir was there, like, dude, okay, like, let's do this. Let's do a reversible automation and see what works. Great, yeah, let's do a reversible automation. He turned around, and I was sitting right there and like, sir, what's a reversible automation? He said, undo. You have to manage people. See, a film mix is always 60% of it being a great mix, and 40% of it you convincing the other person it is a great mix, because it is very subjective. Remember, you do not have a signature sound in a mix. No one's coming to see a Sreejesh Nair film. They're coming to see a director's film. That is very important to know. If the movie bombs, your name is not on the line. It is their name. If the movie is a hit, maybe. Oh, the sound was great. Okay, we'll call you for the next film. No, there's another thing, by the way. If it sounds great, it's brilliant sound design. If it sounds bad, it's a bad mix. Either way, we don't get credit if you're mixing. But here's the thing. So take risks. And when I say take risks, the important rule to remember is there are no wrong things in film sound. There might be sounds that do not work for that given context. It'll always work somewhere else. Like Vijay was talking about, wind and leaves in a forest, which is great. You're looking at it, it's calm, you have wind and leaves. And what if you add a wolf howl? Then suddenly you're on the Omen. You're sitting next to Dracula, you're walking across to Frankenstein's, or you're in Transylvania or whatever. That one wolf sound. So without context, none of these sounds actually make sense. So take risks. With your mistakes are not a mistakes. They're just a sound that doesn't work in that given context. Talking about which, if you want, so I spoke about all of this, and this is something that is very rarely shared out. So if you want to get a copy of the Pro Tools template that I use for my mixes, when I say even now, this is the template that I use for the mix that I did 2 weeks back as well. You can take that up. And what I wanted to leave you with is the fact that don't constrain yourself out of idea. It is your ideas that takes someone's description of saying the sound has to be larger than life, which is an emotion, into a movement on your console, which get translated to something on the DAW, and that comes out of your speakers. This is very important. Dream without limits. There are these 3 things that you follow, and that's how you mix a film. Thank you so much. Any questions? I'm happy to take. And if there are no questions, that also means I'm a great storyteller. You don't ask questions about the story. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming. I'll be at the Ansata booth if there are any further questions, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, sir. I request sir to stay on stage for a moment and Miss Smita to please give him a token of appreciation.